What's going on, everybody? So today I want to talk about one of the most controversial topics in Futures and Foresight, and also a topic of great interest with what we've been experiencing today with the current pandemic. I want to talk about wildcards. More specifically, this video is going to be about 1. What are wildcards, and 2. How to identify them and deal with them in Futures and Foresight practice. And by the way, just a disclaimer before we start, this video is based on evidence and you will find all the references I've used to create this video in the description box down below. When what I'm going to say is not based on evidence but just my opinion, I will say it. Okay, let's jump right in. What is a wildcard? Well, there is a lot of disagreement as per the answer to that question in Futures and Foresight. So let me first tell you what most of us agree on. First, a wildcard is an event. It is not a driving force. In other words, it seems to occur at one point in time rather than over time. And by the way, if you don't know what a driving force is, I suggest you take a look at this video where I've explained that in detail. Second, that event is not reversible. We cannot undo it. It's like eggs. Once we scramble them, we cannot unscramble them. Third, that event, when it happens, it has a huge impact on human society in all of its aspects. In other words, that impact is broad range, both in different industrial sectors as well as different geographical locations. Fourth, that event is very low in objective probability, and that is, no matter how likely different people may believe that event is, it is actually not that likely. It doesn't occur that often, at least in the time span explored in our Futures and Foresight exercise. Fifth, although that event is unlikely, it is still imaginable. It is not completely beyond our ken. It is still knowable. We cannot predict it, that is, we cannot assign a future date to it, but we can anticipate it, although it's difficult. And lastly, sixth, that event can be both positive and negative. In fact, although there is a lot of talk about negative wildcards, wildcards can also be positive. Okay, so let me give you some examples of wildcards that subscribe to all of those 6 attributes. A tsunami or a pandemic or the discovery of a new energy source are all wildcards. And that is because 1, they're all events, 2, they're all irreversible, 3, they're all very high in impact on human society as a whole. 4th, they are all very low in objective probability, at least in the time span explored in Futures and Foresight. That may be 10 to 20 years, all right, not indefinitely. 5th, they're all imaginable. And lastly, 6th, although a tsunami and a pandemic are negative wildcards, the discovery of a new energy source is a positive wildcard, which corroborates the idea that wildcards can be both positive and negative. And by the way, just to be clear, for those of you who like the term black swan or black swan event, that term refers to a concept that is a bit different from the concept of wildcard. In fact, that term is not indicative of a low probability, high impact event. Rather, it is indicative of an impossible to predict high impact event, mostly negative and rationalized after the fact as predictable. But we don't really use the concept of black swan in Futures and Foresight, so please allow me to continue with the concept of wildcard. Okay, so now that we know everything about what we agree on with regards to what is a wildcard, let me tell you a bit more about what we disagree on. The first point of disagreement is about the difference between wildcards and discontinuities. Some Futures and Foresight practitioners believe that true wildcards are not imaginable. Only what is called discontinuities are imaginable. In my view, this distinction is pointless. If we cannot imagine the so-called wildcards, then we shouldn't worry about them. We should only worry about what we can imagine, discontinuities. But since that is only one class of things, not 2, then we don't need 2 names. We can just pick one. In which case, I would pick wildcard because I just like it more. So please allow me to continue with that term. The second point of disagreement is about the difference in degree of probability between wildcards and discontinuities. Some Futures and Foresight practitioners think that wildcards and discontinuities are synonyms because they both indicate a high-impact, low-probability event. but some other futures and foresight practitioners believe that wildcards are low probability, high impact events, while discontinuities are a bit higher in probability but still high in impact. For example, according to this point of view, a wildcard would be a tsunami, while a discontinuity would be a typhoon. To me, this last point of view is also a bit pointless because insofar as scenarios are a chain of events, and insofar as the practice of creating scenarios does already include the idea of taking into account events that are high in impact and a bit higher in probability than wildcards, then discontinuities are already embedded in the creation of scenarios, and we shouldn't treat them separately, which brings us back to the importance of imagining wildcards as an integration to common futures and foresight practice rather than discontinuities. The third and perhaps most contentious disagreement is on whether wildcards are only sudden events, or not only sudden events, but also turning point events of more gradual phenomena. So, if you follow the second point of view, you not only consider massive natural disasters or pandemics as wildcards because they are sudden, but also, for example, a point of no return in climate change, which is a turning point of a more gradual phenomenon. Now, to me, this last point of view is a bit of a non sequitur. Let me explain why. If we assume that wildcards are imaginable, which is a fair assumption, otherwise, again, we shouldn't care for them, then it means that if we do our homework well, there must be signs in the past that point towards wildcard events in the future, even if small and difficult to identify. Then, if we can identify those signs and the wildcard is sudden, it means that those signs are events in the past similar to the future wildcard, and since those events are separated by long lapses, we sort of forget about the next one, so we get surprised when it happens, like financial crisis. This justifies sudden events to be wildcards, at least in the time span explored in futures and foresight, because they are still high impact and low probability. However, if we can identify those signs and the wildcard is a turning point of a gradual phenomenon, then it means that those signs in the past are not past events separated by long lapses, but a crescendo of phenomena that make the point of no return wildcard eventually highly probable, which violates the idea that wildcards should be high impact, low probability. So bottom line, I think that wildcards are only sudden events because that does not violate the low probability, high impact assumption. Now, that being said, there are a lot of futures and foresight practitioners who stress the importance of identifying high probability, high impact wildcard events in futures and foresight practice. And that is those events that are not known by most people, including futures and foresight practitioners and planners, or not credible by most people, or difficult to discuss about because they are elephants in the room, such as a turning point in climate change. Now, I certainly share those concerns. We have to identify those events in futures and foresight practice, but I don't think we should treat them as wildcards, and that is a special class of events to be added to our regular futures and foresight practice, and that is because all those events are high probability, and any high probability event should already be included in our scenario work if it is done well, as I mentioned before. In other words, I think we should consider wildcards only those events that are very low in objective probability, high in impact, and sudden, and pay extra attention to them in futures and foresight practice, because if we don't, we won't account for them in our scenarios, whereas other classes of events will be accounted in our scenarios almost automatically if we do them well. Which brings us to the next point of this video, how to identify and deal with wildcards in our scenarios. So first, how do we identify wildcards? Well, although wildcards are difficult to identify, as I mentioned before, there are signs in the past that may be precursors of wildcards. And those signs are nothing else than weak signals. That's right, weak signals are those single examples of change limited in geographical scope and of which few people might have heard of that may be precursors of future wildcards. For example, teleporting a muffin from point A to point B would be a very strong weak signal precursor of human being teleportation, which is a future wildcard. And that is why horizon scanning, the activity by which we look for weak signals, is such an ideal activity to help us imagining wildcards. And by the way, if you don't know what horizon scanning is, I suggest you take a look at this video where I have explained that in detail. But that being said, wildcards are arguably very difficult to identify just because they are at the fringes of our knowledge, just because they are our blind spots. So there are extra steps we can take to make sure to identify a fair amount of wildcards in our Futures and Foreset practice. One way to do that would be to conduct extra rounds of brainstorming or interviews with different people who were not originally involved in the main Futures and Foreset project. Another way to do that would be to fill up a wildcard grid where we force ourselves to think of several high-impact, low-probability events for every dimension or category of the grid where wildcards with relevance to the focal issue could originate. And that grid could be simply based on the STEEP framework, that is, social, technological, environmental, economic, and political dimensions. To make sure that the identified events are indeed wildcards, we could give each of them a score, say from 1 to 5 on impact and a score from 1 to 5 on probability, plot the two scores on an impact probability matrix, and make sure they are indeed on the top left corner of the matrix, and that is high impact, low probability. And if they're not, they're probably just weak signals. Okay, but when we have identified a fair amount of wildcards, how do we deal with them? In other words, how do we incorporate them in our Futures and Foreset practice? Well, the key to that is to choose the 2 or 3 most critical wildcards for the topic we're looking at and create 2 or 3 scenarios based on them in addition to our regular scenarios. We don't need more than that because at the end of the day, wildcards are not used to predict low probability, high impact events, but only to train our minds to be more prepared and less surprised by that kind of event. We use them to enhance our capacity of preparedness. So bottom line, we have to create 2 or 3 wildcard scenarios. What is a wildcard scenario? Well, a wildcard scenario is a scenario where the wildcard is at the beginning of it and then it develops further, or a scenario where the wildcard is dominant in it at some point of the narrative. And just a few tips on how to do that. Well, first, we have to think of how far does the impact of the wildcard go in the scenario and include that in the narrative. And second, we have to describe both positive as well as negative repercussions of the wildcard. In fact, although wildcards are often described as negative, just by their systematic nature, they also must have some positive repercussions. In fact, when some people lose, others gain. So I really hope that you liked this video and I hope that it helped you to be more clear about what are wildcards, how do we deal with them, and also why we use them in Futures and Foreset. If you liked this video, I would super appreciate if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also, please let me know what other topics of Futures and Foreset you want me to cover in future videos in the comments down below. And I'll see you in the next one.